Kate, thanks for coming on Illuminating Teams. It's great to have you here.
Great to be here.
So I want to start off with a little bit of your background. So we obviously got to know each other in London, or for those who don't know, and you were working as a lawyer when we got to know each other. Obviously, your career's changed and progressed quite a lot over the last 10 years. So can you tell us a little bit about your background and how you ended up in the role you are now of Chief of Staff?
Yeah, absolutely. Happy to share that. So you're right. I'm a trained lawyer, started off working in mergers and acquisitions. So really focusing on the oil and gas sector. I'm from Perth originally, and everyone tends to end up either working in resources or oil and gas. So did that in private practice for about 8 years in Perth and in London, where obviously we met and spent a bit of time together. And then after that, I was really interested in what was happening in the technology space. So wanted to spend a bit of time kind of understanding how I could utilize my legal degree to transfer into working in technology. I thought it was a really interesting area, obviously up and coming. The ability to work with engineers I thought would be super interesting. So I ended up moving back to Australia, to Sydney, and working for Vodafone as an in-house lawyer, where I got some amazing experience around coding and just engineering and legal technology issues generally. Which then kind of opened a door into working in-house in the startup world, which is where I kind of reside at the moment. And I was given an opportunity because of the skill set I had around fundraising and investment through the M&A side of things, but then also the technology side of things. And there's not that many technology lawyers out there. So I was actually approached by Safety Culture, which is one of the larger software companies that has originated in Australia. It's what they call a unicorn. So it's got a $1 billion valuation, which is very exciting. And actually started off as head of legal there. So got to set up all the processes and procedures around the legal department. And I think at that stage, they had about 100 people. And when I ended up leaving 3 years later, they had about 600. So that sort of explains to you the growth and trajectory of the company. And so I started off as head of legal, and then our chief operating officer actually moved on to a different role. And there was a period of time where we struggled to kind of replace that role, given the skill set that was needed. So I had this opportunity to step into the operations space and really sort of double down on working with the executive team at that stage and also the broader cohort of staff. So I ended up getting a tap on the shoulder from the CEO saying, hey, love you as the head of legal, but I think you've got this great opportunity here to kind of broaden your skills and your experience today. And would you be interested into moving into a chief of staff role? Now, I had no idea what a chief of staff role was at the time. It kind of felt like something that was on the West Wing, that was like some sort of American politician, chief of staff. And that was kind of my knowledge at the time. So I started Googling and I started asking around, and luckily I have a good friend, Amy Glancy, who's actually chief of staff at Atlassian. Obviously extremely well-known and renowned Australian company. So reached out to her and said, hey, can we have a chat about this elusive chief of staff role? And she gave me some fantastic insight into the role. And what I really came to find is that it's different for every company. So the chief of staff role at Safety Culture has been different to the chief of staff role at Milkrun, which I'm in at the moment. But I moved from legal into chief of staff, and it's been a fantastic progression. Absolutely loved it. And I think I'm going to stick with it for quite some time.
Awesome. So how long were you in the chief of staff role at Safety Culture before you moved to Milkrun?
Yeah, so I was there for about 18 months in the chief of staff role. And it's a role that you tend to find is hired vertically. The reason being is that you get to know the team members on the ground and you need to build an element of rapport with them. And I think doing that is like the easiest way to do that is really by getting into a business and working in the skill set you know, and then kind of stepping up once you've kind of proven yourself amongst the teams in terms of rapport and trust to make sure that issues are being escalated to you in a chief of staff role. And then I moved into Milkrun as a chief of staff, and I've been there for just over a year.
Okay, great. And so can you tell us a little bit more about what, I guess you've given us there just a top level introduction, but a little bit more about what a chief of staff does. And I suppose you've said it depends a little bit, but what, maybe you can tell us a little bit more about what chief of staff look like for you at Safety Culture and now what it looks like a bit more in Milkrun.
Yeah, absolutely. Happy to share that. And like I said, it's a very varied role and often depends on the type of skill set that the individual has going into the role. So mine's very heavily skewed towards the legal background. But effectively, the role is on the executive team. So sitting alongside chief executive officers, chief operating officers, chief technology officers, however the business unit is set up. And you're really there to provide that cohesion between that executive leadership team and the rest of the workforce. So you kind of have the ability to see this 1,000-foot view of the company. Now, in terms of day-to-day operations, you're normally aligned to one of the executive team members. So traditionally, that's the CEO, but can also be the COO, and you shadow them. And you are basically a second person that they can rely on, both to be a sounding board, to step into meetings if they can't attend, to triage issues that might be escalated up to the executive team, but don't necessarily warrant executive team time or view at that stage. So a lot of my job is making sure that people on the ground are being heard and that issues are being escalated, and also information is being disseminated down. So one of the biggest problems with startups is that things move really quickly. And if you don't have someone who's kind of in charge of making sure that that information flow is working, it can be really hard to grow and scale. So especially at Safety Culture, I spent a lot of time sort of ensuring that things around investments or funding were being explained, equity arrangements were being explained to the wider group, really setting up any teams that we might need as we grow and scale, and just really being a sounding board for the CEO, making sure that if there was projects that he wanted to focus on or drive to ensure that we're meeting KPIs or OKRs, that sort of sits within my remit as well. At Milkrun, it's a little bit different. Milkrun's very much an operations business. So Safety Culture was a software company, is a software company, whereas Milkrun is, if you're not sure about it, it's a 10-minute grocery delivery business, which allows groceries and in fact other goods to be delivered directly to the consumer within a short amount of time. We say 10 minutes, but obviously that does depend on a whole raft of variable factors, but it's very much operations based. So we've got dark stores throughout Sydney and Melbourne. So in my role as chief of staff there, I still leverage a lot of my existing legal experience, but I'm also responsible for things like expanding the business into new areas. So finding and locating sites, identifying where we should grow into from a strategy point of view, as well as a bit more of that executive leadership that I mentioned before. So really helping the team scale and grow, stepping into areas where there might not fit into the engineers, or it might not fit into the sales team, or it might not fit into the HR team, but someone needs to manage it. So that's when it kind of falls to me to make sure that it's being done and it's being actioned.
Thanks, that's great. That's very thorough description. So it sounds really interesting because you've got really diverse sort of responsibilities there. It must be a really interesting job to have that connection between the executive team and also I guess it's sort of middle and upper level staff as well, but probably depends a little bit on maybe in Milkrun compared to Safety Culture, you might be even closer to the ground. I think you touched on one of the challenges there, which you said was information dissemination as being a key challenge in a fast-growing startup to disseminate that information from the top down. Are there any other or sort of unique challenges that you've seen in your experience working with fast-growing startups in terms of particularly in terms of people and culture issues?
Yeah, absolutely. So I was one of the very first employees at Milkrun, and we're actually up to about 1,000 employees now within a 1-year period. So astronomical growth. There's some amazing benefits of seeing that unfold, but it is tricky at times. And it's really hard because the business does go through these iterations as a startup or a scale up. Every 6 months, I like to say that I'm put out of a job. So I'll do a job for 6 months, and then I have to basically reframe my entire mindset and see that we're now in a different place. At the start, we won't have things like budgets, or teams won't have necessarily a whole lot of guardrails or direction. And then that sort of structure and process comes into place. And people then, from a cultural point of view, need to be able to transition from a less structured environment into a more structured environment. And I think one of the hardest things is maintaining culture when you're growing at such a rate. You really don't want a situation where there's kind of this HQ presence that isn't aligning with the operations team or the team on the ground. You really want to make sure that you're a united front. And also you want to make sure that people have the opportunity to be heard. So one of the things that we do a lot of is really spending time around values. So doubling down at an early stage on what the core values are for the company, and really aligning the teams around the reasons for that and bringing them along on the journey, and saying that this is going to be hard. There is a lot of things to do in a short amount of time. A lot of businesses fail. We've got a lot of pressure on our back. But if we just keep coming back to those values and making sure that we're all aligned in terms of that North Star and where we're heading, then I find that gives people and teams the comfort that they need in order to know that it might not be perfect the way that we're doing things, but we're heading in the right direction.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. On that, I think something interesting I read about Milkrun, as obviously you have a lot of staff who are delivery riders, I suppose. I'm not sure if that's what you call them, but and I read that Milkrun employs all their staff, so it does seem to be a little bit different from some other sort of gig economy style business models when it comes to this style of business. So I think that seems to be a much fairer model for the people, the employees having sort of the benefits of being employed. But I was wondering if there are any other benefits you see, or are there any other reasons or rationales of why you've decided to take Milkrun in that direction in terms of for the people and culture?
Yeah, absolutely. So I think I sort of touched on that divide between HQ and the guys on the ground, the team on the ground. And I think part of that is exasperated when you do have a contractor model. There is this feeling of not really being part of that core team. And it's really important to make sure that people do feel like they're part of HQ, they're part of the brand, they're part of the growth story. So we made a decision really early on about ensuring that the employees were not sort of bundled into the gig economy model or the contractor space. And that was because there's a raft of reasons. So obviously pay is fair and transparent. From a safety point of view, it's really important that the teams have access to things like workers' compensation and get benefits of employee assistance programs, for example, that we have at head office, which everyone in the business is able to access. So they've got the ability to kind of dial in and get access to counsellors, etc., if they're going through the stresses of life. The other reason as well is really from a branding point of view. So the Milkrun riders wear the Milkrun shirt, and there's something really special about, and get on a Milkrun bike, and we provide all of that, so we know it's safe and everyone's been trained. And there's something really special about going to work in the morning in a uniform and feeling like you're entering the workspace. And so we wanted to make sure that people do that. So the expectation at Milkrun is that everyone wears the t-shirt and everyone's able to basically have the opportunity to progress through the ranks. And in order to do that, you need to be an employee. So I'll give you some examples. HQ staff are really encouraged to do rider training and then actually do a couple of shifts on the bike, or go into one of our warehouses and pick pack there to really get an understanding and a feel for being on the ground. And in the flip side, we're in the process of really looking at how we can make sure that the riders and the pick packers have the opportunity to progress their career development through things like certifications, ongoing upskilling, and then if they want to come and work in HQ, providing those sort of career pathways where possible.
Yeah, that's fantastic. I really like that. Um, and so you've set up, obviously started here in Sydney, but you're in Melbourne as well. Is that correct? Operating in Melbourne as well,
Yeah, that's
and
right. That's
and
right.
probably and I assume plans for expansion beyond in the future. So I was wondering about how it's been setting up a sort of distributed organization, and what type of things have you done to sort of try and build cohesiveness in the team as they're sort of dispersed, I guess locally, geographically, they're dispersed as well as across different cities.
Yeah, absolutely. And this is something that sort of straddles safety culture and Milkrun. So Milkrun, you mentioned, is in Sydney and Melbourne with dispersed teams. Safety culture as well was operating in multiple countries. So in the US, in the UK, we had offices, also in Manila with the call center. And so it's maintaining culture across dispersed teams is something that you have to be really conscious of. It doesn't just happen, unfortunately. I think as an executive leadership team, it needs to be front of mind, because ultimately, if you don't have a good culture, you don't have a strong business. So the little things that help with that is spending time working on kind of the hierarchy or the structure, and making sure that people have the right management in place. So for example, we know that with dispersed teams, each of our hubs, is what we call them, the dark grocery stores, has a hub lead who then reports into an area manager, estate manager, and then into HQ. Now, it's really important that there's that line of communication, like I spoke about earlier. So we spend time setting up that structure, and then what we do is we continually review it. So what we don't try and do is set and forget and think that that's going to be perfect, because the business is growing so rapidly that we have to be really conscious and considerate about how we structure the teams. So that's an ongoing process. The other amazing thing we did at Safety Culture was actually once a year, the CEO was a big proponent of bringing everyone together. So we had the opportunity to do a conference internally, where a lot of the customers came to speak, and you really get to build those sort of personal and interpersonal communication skills with people that you work with overseas, with time differences and people working from home at the moment. It's absolutely critical, I think, that you do have those opportunities to engage in person where at all possible.
For sure. And are there other things that you've done in either of the businesses to sort of build relationships in the team, sort of, I guess, more in that setting, in a remote distributed setting?
Yeah, so I mean, we've done some fun things in the past. I've done everything from doing breathwork classes online, so getting everyone to dial in, working with meditation teachers. We've even had a tarot reader come in and do everyone's tarot online, and just sort of really inject a bit of fun into it, because there is that disconnect. Everyone's staring at a screen these days. It's really important to kind of shift that energy and that mindset, and to make sure that you're spending time just getting to know the people in your team. So I find the best way of doing that is really bringing in third parties, getting them to do some teamwork, breath work. I've also worked with resilience companies before. There's a fantastic company called the Resilience Project in Australia that does a lot of work around mental health. And so kind of bringing people together with a common subject, encouraging them to get to know each other, have some open and honest conversations, and just build that team rapport. And you can do it online. You don't have to do it in person. It's possible to do a lot of that stuff online these days.
Yeah, I totally agree. Thanks. That's super interesting. I think one final thing, just to wrap up, which I always like to ask everyone, is obviously you're a leader, and you're leading a team or teams, and so I was wondering if there's any books or resources, it might be a podcast or something that you like referring to, or that you've learned something interesting from, that you've taken into your leadership role.
Yeah, I'm a big proponent of this. I think I mentioned one of my roles as the chief of staff is actually to set the agenda for the executive leadership team meetings. And at the bottom of every meeting agenda, I like to put a little resource in there, just to make sure that the team are kind of on top of the goings on of best practice. And one that I always come back to is the Netflix book, which is No Rules Rules. And I think in the startup space, it really resonates because there's some fantastic information in there about things like how travel policies and leave policies don't necessarily work for all companies. So at Netflix, they actually don't have a leave policy. You can just apply for unlimited leave. And they're a big proponent of making sure that people are mentally sound working there and have taken the necessary time off. And all the statistics actually show that when you do provide people with the opportunity of unlimited leave, they tend to not, you know, do anything out untoward in that respect. Most people are pretty good. And the same with travel policies. You know, we spend a lot of time in companies preparing documents, telling people what to do. But really all it comes down to when they talk about this in the book is treat the money of the business like you would your own. And you completely change that mindset and shift the understanding of employees to make sure that they're thinking about how this business and resources and money is absolutely critical. So I've always liked those kind of elements and would highly recommend No Rules Rules.
That's a good one. I haven't. It's a book, or is it a
It's a
book?
book, yeah.
It's a
I've
book.
got it.
Yeah, yeah. I haven't
Read
read it,
Hastings.
so yeah, I'll have to get my hands on it.
I'll
That's
send
a
one
great
your way.
recommendation. Yeah, please do. All right, fantastic. Thanks so much for your time, Kate. It's been really insightful. So thanks for coming on and sharing all that with us. And hopefully we'll get to catch up soon.
Amazing. Thanks for having me, Dan. Appreciate it.